Welcome to Season 6 of The Good Pod. Today's podcast is presented by Dr. Barry Napier.
What is the meaning of church? What does church mean? It depends on the scriptural context. Here we will examine the word as it is given in God's word. In Matthew 16:18, we read this, "And I say also unto thee, that thou art Peter, and upon this rock I will build my church, and the gates of hell shall not prevail against it." This text is much abused by ecumenists and Roman Catholics. The church, meaning the whole universal church, is built on the rock, Jesus Christ, not on the small boulder of Peter. For this, see my Bible study in Matthew 16 and Ephesians 1 and 5 and Colossians 1. The word church appears 77 times only in the New Testament and has exactly the same list of possible meanings in each case. Of course, I'm referring to the King James Version. The meaning used in each text is the interpretation required by the verse's content and the context. The word used in every verse is ecclesia. That's said ecclesia, with emphasis on the C. It is a feminine compound noun based on two other words, that is, the preposition ek, which denotes the origin, and the verb kaleo, meaning to call, usually loudly. To invite, to call by name, or to give one a name, all these are imperatives. They must be done. There are other similar meanings, but none, when used to refer to a local church, includes the idea of making a choice or to be invited to say yes or no. A calling by God is always effectual and is always a command. Now, ecclesia, this is itself, although it's a good word, it's the true word, it is often misapplied by some very zealous Christians. Anyway, in the Greek the word has only one prime meaning, but four sub-meanings, with a further 5 categories that arise from those. Now, the prime meaning of ecclesia, a gathering of people who come from their homes to a public place. Once there, they are an assembly of people. This gathering can be for any public reason, and those who gather may or may not be Christians. Therefore, its interpretation depends on the context. Now, the sub-meanings. The first one, the Sanhedrin, could call people to gather to make decisions. It is possible to expand this to include a public meeting of any race or creed called by a council of any kind. Number 2, the gathering of all the Israelites. For instance, when Joshua wanted to know who they stood for, God or self, or annual Passover feasts. Number 3, sub-meaning, a deliberate gathering of a noisy throng of men who happen to meet in the same place. And the 4th, a gathering of Christians for any reason. So we can already see, I hope, that just using the word ecclesia and assuming that it always means the people of the church, that is Christians, is not a very good idea. So, it may or may not be a gathering of Christians. This is why each use of the term must be carefully defined. Within these categories we have other sub-meanings, such as A, those from the same village or town who gather with a united purpose. B, Christians gathering for worship in a place held for religious reasons, what we sometimes today call a church. C, a specific gathering, regular or ad hoc, that meets to practice the same beliefs, rites and ordinances, and who join by choice to meet and to observe the same rules, whether from God or not. D, all Christians throughout the whole earth. And E, it even includes the idea of dead Christians who form an assembly of saints already in paradise, or rather ready to enter heaven. So what are the conclusions from this? Church is an English transliteration. It can have one of 10 different meanings. That is why no one should assume church always means the same thing. For a church can even apply to a gathering of witches or cultists. It can refer to a gathering of Marxists or other political agitators, and so on. A church came to mean a building where Christians met, and the word was used whether or not genuine believers met there. Then it was applied to people who met with heretical purposes, and by those who are in denominations. All the above can be called a church, or ecclesia. This is why we must be careful to define what we mean in each and every case. Christians are all part of the heavenly ecclesia, which is usually written with a capital C for church, or preceded by the definite article the. Local gatherings of believers are referred to with a lowercase c, church. All but genuine local Christian churches are members of the divinely appointed universal church, whose head is Jesus Christ. But not all that call themselves a local church are genuine. Many are deceivers and deluded. Thus they share the same condemnation as those who were Israelites in name only. So beware, there are millions attending what they call churches today. But how many of those are genuine? I can tell you that very few are. The whole church can issue teachings all based on the words of God, and all believers must listen to them and obey, not because a particular pastor or local church says so, but because they utter the commands of God himself. Those who will not listen and obey must be treated as heretics, as we see in Matthew 18 verse 17. If a whole local church consists solely of heretics, it is not a part of the true universal church. This is because at all times church refers to people, not places. In many texts, church does not show the capital C, but the context defines whether or not it refers to the whole church, that's capital C, or a local church, small c. In one particular instance, Moses met with an angel in the wilderness, and the two were referred to as the church, because any number of believers together, from two to as many as you wish, are a gathering of the church, capital C. For that, see Acts 7, verse 38. Every local church must have elders, Acts 14:23. They are also called presbyters, bishops, pastors. All these names refer to the same person. And whilst a local church is autonomous, it is, however, subject to the same divine laws and demands issued for the whole church, the church universal. The elders are responsible for making sure these are followed and obeyed. Here elders are called overseers or episkopos. An ecclesia may meet anywhere, including a house. You see that in Romans 16, verse 5, 1 Corinthians 16:19, Colossians 4:15, Philemon 1:2, etc. In the days of the earliest churches, many met in secret beside streams or rivers, and many more met in Jewish synagogues until the 4th century AD. Therefore, much later, an actual church building was commonly called a church, but scripturally a church refers to a gathering of genuine saved men and women, whether they met outdoors, indoors, or in a formal building, a hired hall, or even in the home. Possibly the first example of a place being called a church is found in 1 Corinthians 11, verse 18, where believers met in the church. We should not thus routinely state that church is a building. Here it means a collection of people who were all saved believers. Therefore, when one is invited to a church, it should mean being invited to join with an assembly of Christians. Because of their salvation, the place they met in was known as a church. But it should not be assumed that the building on its own is a church. It is only a church when it is occupied fully by believers. Therefore, if it is occupied by a mixture of saved and unsaved, as is usual today, it cannot, strictly speaking, be referred to either as the church or a church building in the Christian sense. In other words, if all those who meet are Christians, then the building they meet in can be called the church, simply for convenience. But if there is a mixture, it is an unholy alliance of people, no better than a political gathering. Logically then, if all those who attend are believers, once they leave and the building is empty, it is no longer the church, but is simply a building. This is especially so when the building is rendered empty by non-use. God is not a living God to an empty church that's falling to rack and ruin. In 1 Timothy 3 verse 15 we see that a local church which has all saved members and is open regularly is also named the house of God, or the church of the living God. Some try to say that church also means synagogue. Synagogue has several meanings, and one of them is a congregation or assembly. However, this refers to an assembly of Jews, and is also the name of a Jewish building used for Jewish worship. And there are 4 separate words for it, and none of them is ecclesia. Though in one Hebrew word there can be the same meaning as an assembly of persons. Strictly speaking, the assembly refers to Jewish people when talking about synagogues. In Revelation 2 verse 9 and 3 verse 9, we also have reference to the synagogue of Satan. The word synagogue in these texts means an assembly of Jews or buildings that they meet in. Otherwise it is used of any assembly of men. In Acts 13 verse 43, the Revised Version translates as synagogue, whereas the King James Authorized Version translates as congregation, which is better. In James 2 verse 2 there is reference to Jewish Christians, where the word assembly is the Greek for synagogue. In most New Testament texts, the word translated assembly is the Greek word ecclesia. However, one text using assembly refers to the Jewish synagogue, as in James 2:2. Thus, church can mean a number of things, and the interpretation in any single text relies on specific content and context. In virtually all cases, synagogue should not be assumed to also mean a Christian church, especially as most churches today are just gatherings of ungodly people.